I just want to say that, just give a little brief background of what drew me to critical disability studies in the first place. And as Ariel said, I've worked in long-term care and with adults and children who had disabilities for many years. I've worked in those areas, and I went out to Winnipeg in 2001, accompanying my husband who had a transfer in his employment. And while I was there, I worked in personal care homes, and I was introduced to independent living resource centers, into organizations that were run by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. And I was very impressed with not only the philosophy of the organization, but the amount of things that they managed to achieve and the work that they did in Manitoba. But I did a consultation with them. They needed someone to do an evaluation of a new program that they had put in place. And so while I was there and being introduced around the agency, I happened to notice they had a wall which was covered with artwork. And at the top it said, "Celebrate Disability Culture." And I was disability culture. In all my years of working in the field, I'd never heard of disability culture. And so I was very interested and surprised that this was an area, a field of theory that I had never been introduced to. So from that, I took a couple of theory courses in disability studies and decided that I was going to look at this further in my PhD thesis. And today I'm going to take elements of that thesis and just talk about social work education, because that's what I looked at, in relation to disability studies. Because I felt there was a huge gap in the theoretical knowledge that we weren't getting access to as social workers. So that's how I'll start. I also want to say that I'm certainly not an expert in disability studies or critical disability studies. I don't think anybody can be, and that's one of the beauties of that interdisciplinary field, is that things are developing constantly from different disciplines. They all contribute to critical disability studies, humanities and social sciences. I also want to explain that I use the terminology disabled person and disabled people interchangeably, and that's because disability activists have reclaimed the word disability in the political sense, in terms of its social, economic, and political environments that disable people. So that's why I use that terminology. Okay. So I want to start with you had troubles with this earlier. Let's see. Here we go. Looking at early definitions of disability, because what I'm going to do is look at disability studies, past, present, and future, and then compare it with social work education, past, present, and future. Social work education addressing disability. So a key turning point in the British disabled people's movement occurred in 1974, when the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, which was an advocacy group of mostly physically disabled people, introduced the definition of disability as a social construction, describing disability as the disadvantage or restriction of an activity caused by contemporary social organization, which takes little or no account of people who have physical impairments, and thus excludes them from participation in the mainstream of social activities. Now, this was a totally different way of looking at disability. Didn't focus on impairment, but focused on how society created disability by making things inaccessible or not providing accommodation. It was quite groundbreaking at the time. Another British disability activist, Michael Oliver, later conceptualized disability into two distinct models. the individual and social models of disability. Now, the individual model was underpinned by a personal tragedy theory of disability, including all the medical and psychological aspects. While the social model, as you can see, included all things that impose restrictions on disabled people. So very different approach to disability. Again, going back to that original definition in which it's society, that it's a social construction, that disability is caused by inaccessibility and accommodation in society. Oliver explained he wanted to develop a binary framework of disability that could be understood by social workers and other professionals. Because Mike Oliver is not only a social work educator, but he's a disability theorist and activist. And he's still very much involved in activism and writing today. He's had numerous editions of his textbook, Social Work Education and Disability, have been published over the years. And one of the things that he always comments on is how in 30 years he still has not managed to shift some of the thinking about disability within social work. So he laments, like, what does it take for us to change our thinking? And I know from working in long-term care and with children with disabilities that it's still very much a medical model framework that's being used to access government services or to get the tax benefit from the federal government. We're still very much caught up in that framework. Now, at the time when he brought this out, it was 1983 when he first published his book. He explained that these two models of disability, but he didn't get much of a good reception from the people that he really wanted to convince that we needed to have a different theoretical framework for disability. But it was embraced by disabled people who were able to connect this model to their own experience. Later, in a book in 1997 called Disability Studies, Past, Present, and Future, Oliver and Barton compiled essays challenging conventional notions of disability. In one of those chapters, one of the contributors was Marcia Rioux, who's at York University, I believe. And she wrote a chapter entitled, When Myths Masquerade as Science, Disability Research from an Equality Rights Perspective. And what she did is basically take the framework that Oliver had developed and looked at it in terms of how do we make research more in line with the social approach to disability. What do we need to do to change policy and to move things forward from that perspective? And so she really did look at that and divided disability further into categories of individual pathology and social pathology. Under individual pathology, she includes treatment or cure of disability through medical and technological means, rehabilitation, and prevention through genetic screening. Under social pathology, which today we wouldn't use the same language, pathology, because again, it tends to implicate a medical approach to disability. She included a structural approach, including environmental factors, the elimination of social, economic, and physical barriers, and a reformulation of economic, social, and political policy, with the recognition that there's a social responsibility to provide political and social entitlements. Today, this approach is recognized widely as the rights outcome approach to disability. I will argue in this presentation that this binary framework for understanding and addressing disability remains the predominant framework within American and Canadian social work textbooks, despite the theoretical advancements within the disability studies literature. So we're pretty much still stuck in this 1997 version or framework of disability. So the aim of my presentation today is to explore the link between the past, present, and future of disability studies with the past, present, and future of social work education addressing disability. In the 20 years since Barton and Oliver's book was published, disability studies has emerged to be a major interdisciplinary field of inquiry. Disability studies past was a radical challenge to individualistic and medicalized thinking about disability. But disabilities present, or critical disability studies, moves beyond this social model to engage with identity politics, ethics of care, political and theoretical appeals to the significance of the body, and the means to be disabled within current social economic contexts. In the disabilities past social model, it argued for a conceptual distinction between impairment as a functional limitation and disability as a socially generated system of discrimination. This binary thinking about disability has undergone many critiques from feminist, cultural studies scholars, and postmodernists, which has led to many tensions and splits within disability studies. So while this social model did move thinking about disability in the right direction in terms of looking at accommodation, accessibility, and entitlements, meaning rights, it wasn't enough, and it was critiqued very soundly, mostly from postmodernism, but also from feminism. Critical disability studies has built on the insights of the social model, but the complexity of identity politics and political and theoretical appeals to the significance of the body and the economic climate of globalization and neoliberalism, have all posed questions about the usefulness of these kinds of frameworks. So just as feminist, post-coloniality, and queer theory have all successfully pushed out the theoretical boat, CDS, or Critical Disability Studies, is now the academic site to watch. It is no longer a case of just adding on women or ethnic minorities to a pre-existing syllabus. The task is to ask how that changes our understanding of society. In short, our understanding of all bodies are affected once we take the difference of disability into account. And I'm really using a lot of the work of Dan Goodley, who wrote an article in 2012, Disentangling Critical Disability Studies. The article was very good because it really provided an overview of all of the different theoretical contributions that different aspects such as feminism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, phenomenology have all contributed to our understanding of critical disability theory. So I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the insights that Goodley has identified as being contributed to the social model of disability. And the first thing we come to is the insights of materialism. The insights of materialism for understanding disability came from a modernist response to the social economic exclusion of disabled people from everyday life. So this was really, this social pathology, social model that Mike Oliver developed, he doesn't call it a theory, he calls it a model or approach, was based on a materialist analysis of disability. Actually, disability activist Dick Finkelstein was a major contributor to the social approach to disability and worked with Mike Oliver on it, although he always gave credit to Mike Oliver. It was Finkelstein who first developed the first materialist analysis of disability, which he published in 1980, Attitudes in Disabled People, Issues for Discussion. Now, what's really interesting about Vic Finkelstein, who passed away in 2011, is that he had moved to Britain from South Africa back when there was apartheid in South Africa, and he was an anti-apartheid protester and activist, and he was arrested, tortured, put in prison for a sentence of 18 months, but he was released after 15 and then moved to Britain. But while he was in prison, he availed himself of the library there and started reading about Marxism. And so he started to think about disability from a Marxist perspective. So he introduced the idea that social relationships are embedded in disability as opposed to impairment, since it arises as the product of material conditions of life at particular social historical junctures. I've read this Attitudes in Disabled People, and it's a fascinating look at the development of industry and capitalism from a disabled person's perspective, and how, you know, capitalism needs disability. It's a fascinating read. I think they have it at the library. It's a monograph. So he brought with him a very well-developed analysis of oppression in relation to disability. Finkelstein's materialist account of disability was criticized on many fronts, as you can expect. His concept of disability as a form of oppression, though, became the reference point in disability studies and actually helped to generate disability studies as a discipline. Disabled people can be regarded as a group whose members are in an inferior position to other members of society because they are disabled people. It is also to argue that these disadvantages are dialectically related to an ideology or group of ideologies which justify and perpetuate this situation. And that's by Paul Averley, who took this notion of disability as oppression and developed it in this seminal paper about disability as a form of oppression, and it was published in 1987. The other contribution that Foucault has made to looking at disability is covered under Bodies That Matter, where the body is viewed neither as a biological or social category, but a surface where multiple codes of sex, class, age, race, and so on are inscribed. And the work of Foucault is viewed as especially important for understanding disability because he places the body at the center of his work. Foucault believed that the body is largely represented in the form of a natural body, devoid of history and culture. Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish, examines how exclusion is a result of a normalizing society and the creation of procedures of normalization against which to measure the body. He describes how during the 18th century, institutional settings such as the schools, barracks, hospitals, and workshops began to regulate and supervise the use of the body in carrying out tasks, and was also made the body the object and target of power. And a good example of that is you can find in a military drill manual. I found that once I'd read Foucault, and I remember I had many years in the reserves when I was younger, and we used to have drill practice. I see Gayla smiling because she knows what I'm talking about. And it was all done by numbers. Do you remember that, Gayla? And so there was an instruction by number for every movement within, ceremony and drill. So it was all done by 1, 2, 3, 1, 4, 1, 2, 3. So every action was broken down into its smallest component part for people to be able to, perform military drill as a group. And we all know in the school system that there are rules of comportment for students in the classroom. So this is what Foucault's talking about, how the body is used and is regulated, right, by institutions and by authority. So Foucault felt that discipline produces subjected and practiced bodies, docile bodies. Discipline increases the forces of the body in economic terms of utility and diminishes these same forces in political terms of obedience. The importance of Foucault's work on this biopower exposes how the vast apparatus of institutions in society, for example, asylums, income support programs, special education programs, create, codify, manage, and control social anomalies through which some people have been divided from others and objectified as physically impaired, insane, handicapped, mentally ill, retarded, and deaf. In the 19th century, scientific discourse influenced our concept of normality, and that's because it's tied to the rise of eugenics and the statistics and scientific claims about the human body. Sir Francis Galton, who was a half-cousin to Sir Charles Darwin, was one of the people who developed statistics and probability in the social sciences. It was Galton who promoted the concept of the bell curve and normality. This myth of the normal body created the conditions for the emergence and subjugation of the disabled body, the racialized body, the gendered body, and so on. And it still influences our approach to disability today in the form of the life model approach to disability. And I'll talk more about that when we get into the social work education piece. Leonard Davis believes that the idea for normal was an effective rationale for a monocultural society that could define itself as the norm and the standard by which others, such as immigrants, indigenous people, people of color, disabled people, would be measured and found to be abnormal according to biometric tests and measures. And I was very surprised, and I don't know why, but there's actually still a lot being written about being able to use the bell curve to determine people's behaviors and how they fit into contemporary society. And this is a book that's not that old, 1994. And I'm sure there's still some people who are using the bell curve in the same way. The next thing I want to talk about is intersectionality. An intersectional analysis shifts attention away from disableism to the problems of ableism. As disability emerges as a site of otherness and marginality, then so do other identities and processes. It's a key task of critical disability studies to explain how these conditions of dominance crisscross in ways that promote values and justify forms of oppression, such as disableism, racism, homophobia, and so on. When disability is thought of as a social relationship rather than as a characteristic of individuals with an impairment, this perspective allows all differentiated bodies to be included in an analysis of exclusion and inclusion. Intersectionality is an important concept for reminding us that homogeneous categories such as woman, gay, disabled, black must all be unpacked and disassembled because they disguise variations in status and power among and between social groups. Social work courses incorporating the concept of diversity, and we see this even in our own standards, accreditation standards, that we now refer to diversity. Before, I think back in 2008, in the standards we referred to oppression. and the oppression of certain groups. And our focus of education was on addressing that oppression. But that changed in 2012 and became diversity, that the focus is on diversity. The concept of diversity tends to focus on celebrating and empowering underrepresented identities. But the underlying assumption being presented by the courses are, even though people have small differences, they're all basically the same. It's difficult for non-disabled people to view disability as part of the diversity paradigm because disability is viewed as being helpless and powerless and subject to a deeper meaning of difference, which is primarily thought of as medical difference. Even though the idea of diversity is to reject the idea of normal ethnicity, there appears to be little problem in deeming disabled people as abnormal. Then Goodley looks at self and other. Critical disability studies has a task to recapture the self from its position as other. And for Goodley, the individual is the key site of everyday life, oppression, and resistance for everyone. And I'll just read this quote from Goodley. Individual, medical, biopsychological, traditional, charity, and moral models of disability locate problems in the heads and bodies and psyches of disabled people. This leads to the commonly held belief that disabling society is not the problem. The disabled psyche is. In contrast, the psyche can be reconsidered as a complex, tightened knot of the person and the social world, the self and other people, the individual and society. At the heart of this is the internalized experience of disableism. Oppression is felt physically, subjectively, and emotionally, but it is always socially, culturally, politically, and economically produced. So we're going to talk just for a minute about psycho-emotional disableism. Disableism is a form of oppression involving the social imposition of restrictions of activities of people with impairments and socially engendered undermining of their psychosocial well-being. Disableism can be experienced from two sources. It can be direct or it can be indirect. Direct psycho-emotional disableism is experienced when a stranger encounters a disabled person and says something that we would consider inappropriate or usually avoids the disabled person altogether. That's a direct form of psycho-emotional disableism. Indirect psycho-emotional disableism occurs when a disabled individual encounters an inaccessible public space, and the cumulative negative effect of these experiences have a negative impact on the person's self-esteem and on their self-image and self-confidence. In summary, critical disability studies engages with many different theoretical sources, such as feminism, postmodernism, critical race theory, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, just to name a few disciplines. Critical disability studies has become an interdisciplinary field of studies closely associated with cultural studies. The major implication of this interdisciplinarity is that it projects a cultural critique, which is rooted in various critical conditions, invariably promoting egalitarian ideas, which are at odds with mainstream values and practices. In an article titled "Disability Goes Cultural," Anne Waldschmidt argues that disability has become the domain of rehabilitation sciences, medicine, psychology, education, and sociology, and I would add social work, for too long. She believes that disability studies needs to engage with those disciplines that have nothing to do with disability: philosophy, anthropology, literary studies, history, sociology, ethnology, media studies, and religious studies. She calls for a cultural model of disability that considers disability neither as an individual fate nor merely as an effect of discrimination or exclusion. And I'm reading a quote from her. First, a cultural model of disability would regard neither disability nor impairment as clear-cut categories of pathological classifications that automatically, in the form of a causal link, result in social discrimination. In any culture, at any given moment, these classifications are dependent on power structures and historical situation. They are contingent upon and determined by hegemonic discourses. In short, the cultural model considers disability not as a given entity or fact, but describes it as a discourse or as a process, an experience, situation, or event. And now I want to look at social work education addressing disability, past, present, and future. So at first glance, social work with its ethical emphasis on social justice appears well placed to be a valuable ally to the emancipatory causes of the disabled people's movement. However, in 2010, I attended a meeting of academics and activists in the field of disability studies while at the Congress of Humanities and Social Sciences that was held here in Fredericton. I was a PhD candidate at the time, working on a thesis that examined social work education and disability. So I was invited to the meeting just to hear contemporary debates within that field of disability studies. And there was one discussion in which the members present discussed where should disability studies be located? What department and faculty is most aligned with the values and theories and ideas behind disability studies? I was impressed because someone immediately nominated social work. And I thought, yes, social work, that's where it belongs. Because I was very keen on what disability studies could bring to social work. But this suggestion was quickly rejected by almost all of the members present. Social work has, one of the members said, social work has never done anything in the past to support the interests of disability studies. And that was the end of that conversation. These comments really piqued my curiosity about the state of social work theory and practice in relating to addressing disability. So my PhD thesis examined approaches to disability in core and specialized curricula at 3 Bachelor of Social Work programs in Canada. Several research studies had already been completed by the Persons with Disabilities Caucus within the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And they found that 86% of BSW programs in Canada had at least one class addressing disability issues as part of their core curriculum. In 2008, the caucus recommended that all courses offered at the BSW and MSW level should have a critical disability focus, which they defined as a rights-based model recognizing the social construction of disability. Now, the research that I undertook and completed in 2013 was based on 2 questions. The first one was, what dominant ideas inform the theoretical lens of disability within social work texts, social work course outlines, and instruction in core and specialized courses related to disability at these 3 BSW programs? And how consistent are current social work perspectives of disability with the dominant perspectives advocated by disability theorists and activists? So I really wanted to see what the fit was between what we were teaching about disability and what was being written about in the disability studies literature. It's not necessary to identify the 3 BSW schools that I visited, except to say that they all had an anti-oppressive social work approach to theory and practice. The 3 schools were chosen to enhance my understanding of common or discordant areas of social work theory and practice in relation to disability studies. And it was not the intent of the study to characterize a particular VSW program as being more consistent with one particular perspective over another, but just to see how various theories and models, particularly critical disability perspectives, were being discussed, studied, and integrated into social work curricula, and therefore social work practice. I used a multi-case study design. I looked at core curriculum and specialized courses related to disability. I looked at the disability services that were being offered on each campus. And I made general observations of the physical accessibility available on campus. I looked at course textbooks, looked at course readings, to examine the approach to disability represented in each sample. And I conducted open-ended interviews with the instructors of the courses and a critical discourse analysis of a class in which disability or some disability-related topic was discussed. And the 3 schools of social work were very generous in allowing me access to all of these areas. I just want to review some of the major assertions that I found coming from my study. And what I did find was that critical disability perspectives were not yet fully integrated into the curricula of BSW programs. It could be argued that disability-related content was introduced during classroom discussions or presentations. However, my interviews with instructors indicated that it was the experience and knowledge of the instructor in relation to disability that had an influence over what was discussed about disability or what particular theoretical approach was espoused. And we know from a survey conducted by the Persons with Disabilities Caucus in 2012 that students do not feel comfortable identifying themselves as somebody who is disabled, and so we're not willing to lead discussions or bring those issues up in the classroom. So it wasn't as if students were contributing to the discussion. What I did find was that there was a need for better or more adequate course texts addressing disability. Now, at the time when I did this study in 2010, I looked for a good social work textbook on disability and didn't find any. So that's a real gap within social work education. So a necessary but not sufficient way to ensure the inclusion of critical disability theories in social work education requires the use of appropriate texts in the classroom. When there was an elective course addressing disability introduced as part of the curriculum, the text tended to provide its students with a range of disability theories, including the individual pathology approach, as well as some critical theoretical perspectives, looking at disability as a form of oppression. However, there were often incongruent messages given by the text in relation to theory and practice. For example, in a chapter on feminist approaches to social work, there was much discussion of the need to overcome obstacles caused by the intersection of disability, aging, and gender. However, in the same social work text, but in a different chapter on social work practice with people with disabilities, the chapter described people with physical disabilities as an example of a client group considered vulnerable in the same way as frail elderly and children needing protection from abuse and neglect are considered vulnerable. A British study on disability content and social work texts found that disability tended to be subsumed under a life cycle or diversity's perspective. The life cycle approach establishes and evaluates individual lives and groups according to developmental milestones, compares the individuals to these expectations, and determines the extent to which they fit or do not fit, which goes back to the idea of normalcy and that idea of the bell curve, that they establish these standards and developmental milestones. The label of normal is often ascribed to phenomena most frequently occurring at each age. And I think we've all been introduced to this life cycle model over the years. It's certainly used to talk about child development. Even when the life cycle approach is not part of the discussion about disability, course content was often organized to reflect the life cycle approach, starting with birth and ending with death and grieving. You've all seen course outlines that are arranged in that way, starting by looking at infancy and childhood and carrying through looking at social work practice through the different developmental stages. Disability theorists argue that the struggle against disableism has to include examination of cultural assumptions that inform the curriculum within social work, because the focus on normality or normalcy through the inclusion of a study of human growth and development is congruent with an individual pathology approach to disability and not conducive to social work from an anti-oppressive practice standpoint. This approach is still used in social work addressing disability in the present context. So what I did is I looked at some of the newer texts that were coming out in the last couple of years to see how disability was being addressed, to see if there was any change from when I had last looked at textbooks. And there's an American social work text that's widely used in the States, Understanding Human Behavior in the Social Environment, and it's part of this empowerment series, very reputable editors and contributors. And it basically supports a life cycle approach to human development, in which they look at disability as a functional limitation that occurs during development. Normalization is identified as an important concept for addressing intellectual disability, meaning that the environmental context of the person is arranged so that it is as normal as possible. And I think when I first came into work for the province of New Brunswick in 1989, we were just being introduced to Wolfenberger's normalization, social role valorization, in which that was exactly the focus, to try and create environments in which would allow people with disabilities to behave in a normal way so that they could fit into mainstream society. An empowerment approach to social work practice in the text is favored based on a consumerist model, focusing on strengths and abilities. Disability culture and history are mentioned as part of the 6 principles of empowerment, but only to the extent that professionals should be aware that they exist. They didn't really explain very much about what was disability culture and history, just that people should be aware of it. Despite the strength-based approach promoted in working with children with learning disabilities, most of the text explains the common problems associated with learning disabilities as well as their pathological causes. The language used is primarily that of the medical model. For example, neurobiological, dysfunction, IQ scores, syndrome, and treatment. One page, which was highlighted and titled Spotlight on Diversity, is dedicated to explaining what people with intellectual disabilities are like compared with people with normal IQs. A more recent review of several introductory social work textbooks used in Canadian schools of social work indicates that the political rights model is being presented and supported in contrast to the medical model. Social work practices include the strengths approach, independent living philosophy, and promoting self-sufficiency. In social welfare in Canadian society, I looked at the 2014 edition. Rosalie Chappell has a chapter on social welfare with people, with disabilities. 3 different perspectives are presented. the impairment perspective based on the individual pathology model, the functional limitations perspective based on the limiting nature of disability, and the ecological perspective, recognizing the impact of the person's environment and the experience of having a disability. Now, the Government of Canada's definition is also presented in the text, and it's a definition of disability developed by the Who, the World Health Organization, in which they state disability is a complex phenomenon reflecting an interaction between features of a person's body and mind and features of the society in which they live. The chapter then discusses the prevalence and types of disabilities in Canada. A person-centered approach to disability is presented based on the definition provided by the WHO, which focuses on measures to be taken, to help people get employment. The implications for social work practice are to move towards a social model of disability in which autonomy, accessibility, and accommodation combined with rights and responsibilities is promoted. And this approach, although still focused on the individual, is consistent with the social pathology approach developed by Mike Oliver and Marcia Rioux in 1997. In a chapter titled Disability and Social Work Practice, in a newer textbook by Ernst and McCullough of McGill University, they refer to two theories of disability, the medical model and the social model. The social model explains disability as a combination of ableist attitudes and disabling environments. A critique of the social model is presented in relation to the absence of a focus on the medical realities of impairment and the assumption that all people with disabilities are oppressed. But they say it does not acknowledge how, as an oppressed group, they experience discrimination and impairment in bodily structure and function. So they had a critique of an oppressive or oppression approach to disability because it didn't take into account that there actually were impacts from impairment and from having the experiences of having that impairment. The importance of the medical model and social model are presented, which is a reflection of the, again, WHO's definition of disability as a biopsychosocial model of functioning, health, and disability. A categorical or diagnostic approach to disability is presented in order to identify the cause and effects of any deviation from normal bodily structures and functioning. Social work practice with individuals with disability include helping clients to navigate systems of care and promoting inclusion. The practice framework is based on an ecological model or approach, although there was some explanation of ableist attitudes and stereotyping. The life course of the individual is also highlighted. And I quote, individuals with disabilities and their families may experience a rupture in their life course due to disability. It's clear that although social work education has moved in the direction of a socio-political approach to disability, there is some confusion on how to link social work practice at the individual level with anti-oppressive, anti-privileged social work practice at the structural level. Perhaps it's because the biopsychosocial definition of disability fits so well with systems theory and with the person and environment perspective of the ecological approach. However, both systems theory and the ecological approach have been critiqued by progressive social work for not dealing with power relationships, focusing on restoring systems to normal functioning, and any lack of an analysis of oppression and privilege. I want to also comment on another assertion in that it's important to look at first-hand knowledge and experience in social work education addressing disability. The experiences and voices of disabled people must be included in the development, planning, and delivery of course content addressing disability. The 7 instructors who were interviewed as part of the study have all taken steps to include aspects of disability studies in the course content. However, anti-oppressive social work practice, which is the practice approach that was espoused by the schools involved, emphasizes the importance of working with individuals and groups experiencing the oppression. Mullally asserts that becoming allies in addressing social injustice and inequality is critical because although oppressed groups are not powerless, they can't do away with entrenched systems of privilege all on their own. So Australian social work educators Helen McCosha and Leanne Dowse believe that the paternalism of traditional social work must be replaced by social work educators becoming allies with disabled people. And they suggest a couple of ways. Social workers need to become involved in supporting individuals and groups that pursue activism through anti-discrimination legislation or direct action through public demonstrations to highlight the barriers that disabled people face. And social workers should subvert their traditional advocacy role to support organizations and individual self-advocacy in pursuing individual and collective best interests. And they also recommend that there should be more co-teaching with people from the disabled groups in the community, and that planning of curriculum and evaluation of courses should also be done in collaboration with groups working with disabled people. Students need opportunities to explore the field of disability from a wide range of perspectives. But most importantly, students must explore the subject from the perspective of disabled people. In this regard, schools of social work or universities could host a symposium for educators, students, and the public to discuss practice issues such as independent living, ethical caregiving, legislation and policy, inclusive education, and disability culture. Now, Bob, in his book on structural social work, talks about how culture has become the core cousin in social work. And an understanding of the role of culture in addressing oppression and privilege is an important element of critical disability perspectives. Observation and reporting of the classroom discussions about disability revealed that social work students are often confused about the role of culture in oppression, particularly in relation to disability. Culture tends to be discussed in relation to multiculturalism and diversity, and the minority model of disability. And in this model, disabled people shift from functional and physical characteristics to one of a shared experience of discrimination and stereotyping. However, a review of the disability studies literature reveals that disability culture fulfills a more complex and important role. Historical examination of disability often represents disabled people as passive instead of active participants in the making of their own history. The history of the disabled people's movement can be traced textually through several important publications. The Last Civil Rights Movement, published in 1989, which was written by Canadian Diana Dreger. The New Disability History, American Perspectives, written in 2004 by Paul Longmore. And Disability Politics, Understanding Our Past, Changing Our Future, published in 1996 by Jane Campbell and Michael Oliver. It includes a close analysis of historical texts from a disability perspective, directing attention to areas that traditional historical texts leave out, such as the experiences of disabled people outside of medical and institutional settings. So disability arts is a very important way for disabled people to confront negative depictions of disability in mainstream art. It provides disabled people with access to mainstream artistic production and includes impairment-focused art and offers a critical response to stereotyping and stigma. A recent example of the power of disability arts to challenge able-bodied assumptions is found in a new National Film Board released Invitation to Dance, narrated by disability activist Simi Linton. The film is described as a never before told coming out story of disabled people staking their claim to equality, justice, and a place on the dance floor. A recent Cripping the Arts Symposium was organized by a nonprofit organization, Tangled Arts and Disability, to move the art community away from thinking only in terms of inclusion within dominant practices and integrating disability perspectives at all levels. So it wasn't just about providing a venue for disability art. The Tangled Arts and Disability Symposium said that we need to be involved in the planning and in the discussion and in every aspect of how this art is used. That's what is meant by inclusion. American approaches to disability culture have focused on linguistic and textual analysis. Rosemary Garland Thompson, a professor of English and a feminist and disability scholar, deconstructs the binary, normal, abnormal depictions that characterize modernist narratives of disability. She believes that cultural work involves challenging stories about disability, then re-narrating disability as an integral part of the human experience. Garland Thompson also has looked at how the development of photography in 1839 enabled the body to be depicted in new ways, but images of disabled people were relegated to medical textbooks. Garland Thompson believes that the self materializes in response to a person's engagement with the environment. And I'll read a quote from her book. The disabled body is a body whose variations or transformations have rendered it out of sync with its environment, both physical and attitudinal environments. In other words, the body becomes disabled when it is incongruent, both in space and in the milieu of expectations. So in conclusion, it appears that social work present is heavily influenced by the vestiges of social work past when it comes to addressing disability in anti-oppressive, anti-privileged social work education and practice. There has been a shift from a social political approach on disability to include feminist, post-structural, and postmodern theory that has introduced critiques including culture, language, and discourse. An understanding of the role of culture in the creation of normative assumptions and identity can provide social workers with important insights into how hegemonic activities of the dominant able-bodied culture impact disability. In recent years, disabled people have come to view cultural revaluation as central to their political struggle. Therefore, social work education and practice must recognize, complement, and support cultural production and analyses of disabled people as a political project and part of the disabled people's movement. In order to engage with theories and activities of critical disability studies, social work students must not only be exposed to the literature, but understand the political functions of culture as a site for critical analysis, for consciousness raising, resistance, and transformation. Social work education must include an anti-oppressive analysis that includes a thorough exploration of cultural oppression. The literature and work of critical disability studies provides an ideal pedagogical context for examining the intersectionality of oppression and the need for anti-oppressive, anti-privileged social work practice strategies at both the personal and cultural levels. To become an ally to disabled individuals and to the interests of the disabled people's movement, social work as a profession must move beyond being a gatekeeper of public services to active participants in demystifying and deconstructing normative culture. Okay, thank you very much.